But let me get into this piece by Jim Garrity. I wasn't planning on reading it, but when I read it today, I said this is so appropriate because it relates to why on many days I choose to simply ignore some of the things in the news. Of course, yesterday we spent some time talking about Donald Trump Jr., but Jim Garrity says, am I the only one who finds the daily whirlwind of controversy, accusations, counter-accusations, allegations, breathless reporting from anonymous sources, non-answers, implausible excuses, implausible spin, angry protest, and shameless behavior that makes up the Trump presidency increasingly, and he says, boring, increasingly predictable? He said this morning, Mike Allen of Axios opens his newsletter by emphasizing that everything we've seen from the president and his family in the past few weeks is not normal. Jim Garrity says, no kidding. Normalcy departed from about the time Scott Walker left the presidential race. Normalcy isn't coming back until the Trump presidency ends. And he says only God knows when that will occur, whether it's 7 years from now or sometime sooner. But the point he's making is we've lived with the abnormality for some long time. He's putting more of the blame on the Trump presidency, but I'm going to put it everywhere because the way the media covers it reinforces some of this. But he says at some point, either today or in the coming days, President Trump will tweet something that will shock and appall his critics, delight his fan base, and get retweeted tens of thousands of times. Donald Trump will probably tweet out something as sad or fake news or the lying media or a particular media figure. Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski and their roundtable will shake their heads in consternation and stern disapproval. Then he goes on to say that then Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Sean Spicer will stand behind the lectern at the White House and repeat over and over again that she or he has not discussed this topic with the president yet. He or she will insist that the president's tweet speaks for itself. White House correspondents will complain that they're getting nothing useful or newsworthy out of the briefings. Then they will flip out at the suggestion that the briefing be ended or no longer be on camera. And again, this is so good because this is exactly what's been playing out over the last 6 months. Then he goes on to say that Vice President Mike Pence will do something far from the president, offering anti-controversy at whatever event he's attending. He will ignore a shouted question about the latest controversial statement from the president and focus his remarks on thanking our veterans, our men and women in uniform, our law enforcement, our teachers, our doctors, or whatever other group is hosting him that day. Then he goes on to say that the House Intelligence Committee ranking member Adam Schiff will declare that the latest revelation is deeply troubling, extremely important, very significant, or profoundly disturbing, and that he will want that person, whoever it is in the news, to testify before the committee. Then there will be a rumor that Senate Republicans will be close to a deal on health care, and there will be rumors that they don't have the votes. And then there will be talk of that just a few more tweaks, they could reach 51 votes, and then it should be done before the shortened August recess, or right after. At some point, then he goes on to say that liberals will gather in large numbers to protest the president, the administration, congressional Republicans, and the existence of the right in general. They will give heated, angry speeches about how all of this will end. They will cheer and chant, and then they will go home, and someone else will pick up the litter that they leave behind. But again, Jim Garrity continues by saying, some liberal pundit you've either never heard of or barely ever heard of will write something that appears to endorse violence against Trump, his family, the Republican congressional leaders, or conservatives in general. The liberal pundit will insist that they never meant that and that it was only a joke or only sarcasm. Conservatives will scream for that person's firing. Liberals will insist that a controversial political statement should not cost someone their job. Then a few weeks later, a conservative figure will do the same, and most people will instantly reverse their positions. Do you love his cynicism? And then finally, I won't get into the rest of this. He says, someone somewhere who has a long history of mental problems will steal a gun and attempt a mass shooting. Liberals will blame the NRA and gun owners. The NRA and gun owners will argue about the need for better mental health programs. Subsequent reporting will detail many red flags and warnings ignored, and voices in the mainstream media will insist it's time for a real national conversation about guns, as if the real national conversation hasn't been going on for years now. he goes on from there talking about sports figures and all the rest. But you might say that is a little bit cynical, but it's one of the reasons why sometimes it's just important to sort of back away from the day-to-day tit-for-tat, back and forth kind of 24-hour news cycle that hasn't really served us well. And it's part of the conversation we had yesterday with Nick Pitts, and certainly we had as well with Chelsea Yeoman. It's probably the conversation we'll have a little bit tomorrow when we have Penna Dexter in studio with us, as well as Jeremy Dice. But again, it's important to sometimes look at the bigger and broader issues, and certainly in the second hour, that's what we're going to do. But when we come back from the break, since Russia is in the news, I want to ask a different set of questions. Our good friend Colonel Alan West, and we need to get him back on the program, wrote a very good piece, When Did Russia Become a Threat? And then, of course, our friends at the National Review and other places have said it's time to get real about Russia. So since Russia's in the news, can we think more carefully, maybe even more biblically, certainly with a level of common sense and historical perspective about what Russia is and what Russia is not, since a lot of that relates to some of the controversy surrounding Donald Trump Jr. So we'll come back and talk about that. Then we're going to be talking with Rachel Alexander. This will be, I think, a very good discussion about the need for you to exercise discernment when you're reading a newspaper, when you're reading an article online, when you're listening to broadcast or watching broadcast. So we're going to get into that with her. And as I mentioned, Dr. Chris Thurman will be with us in the second hour as we talk about his new book, The Lies We Believe About God. Lots to cover today. And by the way, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably heard someone say that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. It is attributed to Joseph Goebbels, but we also have seen it in action. Say something long enough and the people start to believe that it is true. I thought about that when I read the latest issue of Imprimus, which is published by Hillsdale College. It was a summary of a speech by former Sports Illustrated editor Charles Larson about the false stories about Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb holds all sorts of baseball records, including a .366 lifetime batting average and the fact that he stole home 54 times. He was an amazing baseball player, but he also was slandered by a book published after his death. Stories about him beating up black men and sharpening his spikes to injure fielders were all false, but they were repeated so often that most people assumed that they were true. Robert Knight, in a recent column in the Washington Times, uses these lies about Ty Cobb to point to similar examples today. The Black Lives Matter slogan, hands up, don't shoot, comes from the false narrative of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The claims that voter ID laws are merely being used to suppress minority vote is another example. Never mind that many of the legislators sponsoring these bills are African American. Consider how the media covers the undercover videos of Planned Parenthood. Usually they ignore them, but when they do talk about the videos, they usually always use the narrative, heavily edited videos. Anyone who looks at the entire unedited videos available online can see that this description is inaccurate and unwarranted. Whether in baseball or politics, we can see the sad reality that repetition can often turn a lie into the truth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me talk about Russia for just a minute, because that, of course, is in the news, and there are very good pieces that we should maybe post, and we have in the past, just to give you a chance to kind of think this through, because with all this talk about the possible collusion between Russia, it obscures, I think, the need for us as individuals, as citizens, and really even as elected members of Congress to think clearly about Russia. And again, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about the Russian people. The Russian people are very nice, but I'm talking in particular about the leader of the Russian people, Vladimir Putin, and maybe some of the others. And so this is the distinction I want to make. But Alan West really makes a very good point about the fact that we should really ask the question, when did Russia become a threat? I think now everybody considers it a threat, but not so long ago, he reminds us, that was not the case. For example, he says, I remember the week that Obama Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel announced a massive reduction in our U.S. Army and the intent to retire the U.S. Air Force A-10 Warthog close air support platform. He said it was later that week that Russian-backed separatists and camouflaged militants overran Crimea. That certainly would have been enough, you would think, to declare Russia as a threat. And then you have the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and even the subsequent shooting down of a civilian airliner by Russian paramilitary forces using Russian equipment. Yet again, what we got from the president at that point, President Obama, was a terse statement, a try to stare down Putin at summits. But that was about it. He says, I guess we did send them some support. We sent the Ukrainian army socks, but not weapons. Okay, so then he says, well, of course, there were sanctions, let's be fair, but again, these hardly damaged the Russian economy. And so then the question he asked is, okay, if Russia was such a threat, then why is it that President Obama, in an off-microphone moment, he thought at least, whispered over to the then Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, that after his reelection, he would have more flexibility? I mean, why would you want to have more flexibility with a nation that is a threat, he asked. And then he points out that even during the 2012 election, you have, for example, Governor Mitt Romney saying that he believed that Russia was one of our greatest geopolitical adversaries. And he was ridiculed by, for example, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and others for saying that Russia was a threat. So the point that Alan West is making is that when it did not serve the administration to actually refer to or consider or act as if Russia was a threat, it did not. As a matter of fact, he says, now we know that President Obama and his minions knew about the Russian hacking into the Democratic National Committee website, along with John Podesta's email. But again, we say there was never an argument that it was a threat. So the argument that Colonel Alan West makes is simply answered. He says, Russia became a threat when it served the progressive socialist left and their liberal progressive media allies' purpose. And that was certainly the case once it, of course, turned around. And then people began to talk about the connections between candidate Donald Trump and Russia and then President Donald Trump and Russia. So he raises a very good question. And so the question that needs to be answered is, how should we think about Russia? And first of all, one of the things that concerned some of the editors in the National Review is that after the G20 summit in Germany, President Trump said it's time to move forward in working constructively with Russia. Now, if you've been around for a while, and this is why, again, I read that piece earlier by Jim Garrity, you kind of say, this sure feels like deja vu or the movie Groundhog Day, because haven't we heard this before from incoming presidents? Let's think about this. George W. Bush, for example, spent time with Vladimir Putin and said he looked into his soul and felt that he could really work with him. Barack Obama certainly thought that he could establish friendly relationships with this authoritarian leader. Remember, the Secretary of State at that time, Hillary Clinton, had a reset button that she wanted to reset the meeting with the leaders and all of that. And so if you say, well, how did that work out for them? Let's just remind ourselves, as some of the leaders that on the editors for the National Review point out that in the final days of President Obama's presidency, he was actually expelling Russian spies from this country, which I think shows that it didn't quite work out as well as many might have anticipated. So let me quote from the editors for just a minute, because I think they make a very good point. They said, the simple fact is that Vladimir Putin is a cold-eye cynic willing to ruthlessly pursue the expansion of his and Russia's power, whether that means exporting arms to terrorists in the Middle East or assassinating dissidents and journalists at home. Putin's thuggery and the failure of the opportunistic approach of the last 16 years are plain to see. Nevertheless, they say that Donald Trump seems bent on repeating mistakes of his predecessors, and even with less reason to have illusions about the Russian leader. You know, every president comes into office actually pledging to build relationships with Russia, and that never works out. And almost every president comes into office claiming that they're going to move the diplomatic and the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And we can see that there is a very sad pattern that neither of those things work out very well, and we can make a longer list. But I'm going to move on, because one of the other issues associated with Russia is the issue of cybersecurity. And again, let me quote from the editors of National Review, because they have a very good line that kind of makes the case. They said, on cybersecurity, a more realistic view means recognizing that Russia is not interested in an alliance against other nefarious actors. It means recognizing that Russia is one of the nefarious actors. In other words, when you talk about trying to work with Russia to prevent other countries from hacking into our country, one of the countries you're trying to build an alliance with is a country that has been successful in hacking into our country. You get the point. And as they say, any realistic cybersecurity strategy will involve hardening our defenses against Russian threats, which are coming thick and fast, not only against government servers, but also against the digital infrastructure of major American businesses. They go on to say that in this regard, it's critical that the United States not dismiss Russia's election-related hacking with a shrug. American intelligence agencies agree that Russia waged a hostile cyber offensive against the United States in the run-up to last year's election. And a January report from the Director of National Intelligence warned that, quote, Moscow will apply lessons learned from its Putin-ordered campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election to future influence efforts worldwide, including against U.S. allies and their election processes, unquote. So again, the point I'm making here is a good one, and that is, if we really want to be looking at Russia, we need to look at it with clear eyes and understand that although the Russian people may be very nice people, many of you in the listening audience have adopted children from Russia. Many of you have traveled to Russia. We appreciate the Russian people. That's not the issue. The person running Russia and the apparatchik are those individuals that have been bent on actually doing what they can to advance their geographical map, to actually begin to harm us in various ways through cybersecurity. And we delude ourselves if we think that actually partnering with Russia on the issue of cybersecurity isn't, in a sense, allowing the wolf or the fox into the hen house. And so those are some issues I wanted to put on the table. But when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Rachel Alexander. We have posted one of her pieces today, The Left-Wing Bias of the AP Style Manual. This is something I've talked about for decades, but she has now collected so many more examples, and it's a good illustration and a great exercise in helping you develop some media discernment so that you can reevaluate what you read, see, and hear. So I think you're going to appreciate that. Her article appears in the stream, but it's also on our website, pointofview.net. Let me just encourage you, as you go to the website there, you're going to find a couple of things. My commentary today is called Ty Cobb and Truth. It's in large part about the fact that people actually believe it, and then we move on from there to talk about all sorts of other things that have been repeated so often that we actually think they're true, but they really aren't. And so, again, that's part of the need for us to develop some level of discernment. As you go there, you'll also see that there's an opportunity for you to support this ministry. And during these summer months, this is a great time for us to come to you once again and remind you that as people go on vacation, sometimes they don't have a chance to support us. So we're in need of financial support. So if you can help us out, visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says donate, or you might even want to punch on that button and click on that button that says join the Truth Team. For as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you can be part of our Truth Team, and we would greatly appreciate it because you provide the financial foundation for what we do. Let's take a break. We'll talk with Rachel Alexander right after this.
There are those who listen to Point of View while they're driving, and some can listen at home or at work. But here's the question: where do you go where you cannot listen to Point of View? Well, if you have the app, the free Point of View radio app, the answer is just about nowhere. This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Click the Take Action link, learn about important issues, and make a difference in this world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, easily contact us with your comments or questions. Don't leave home or the office or anywhere else without Point of View. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the free Point of View radio app. Oh, and one more thing, if you like it, click that little button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app with you on the go.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that from time to time I do complain about some of the style manuals. In particular, we're going to talk about the Associated Press style manual, but also there is a link that Rachel Alexander has written about the New York Times style manual. But the point is this. You might say, well, what does it matter how you label things? And I've said before that how you label individuals and how you define terms can put you very far down the road to winning the debate. And back in the 1980s, early 1980s, when I started writing newspaper columns, I began to get, a copy of the AP Style Manual just because I wanted to make sure that, since I was writing for a number of newspapers, I wanted to make sure that what I said and how I said it fit into their style manual. And back then, the only real big concern I had was that at that time, they used to have a real bias, I felt, against the issue of abortion because they would not allow you to refer to individuals as pro-life, although in my columns I would do so. But in news stories, you couldn't call people that were pro-life. They were always anti-abortion. On the other hand, though, you could, in many cases, refer to people that were for abortion as pro-choice. So it seemed to me that fairness would be you are anti-abortion, pro-abortion, or you're pro-life, pro-choice. But I didn't actually have that. Now they've changed some of that since then. But we have gone a long way since then because we're dealing with sexual issues, we're dealing with gun issues, we're dealing with all sorts of other topics that the style manual, I think, demonstrates that it leans left. And so this is the way in which these articles are written. This is the way they show up in newspapers. This is the way they show up in various news articles in your internet. And so I want you to learn a little bit more about discernment. So we bring to the microphone the author of this article we've posted on our website, Rachel Alexander, senior editor at The Stream. Of course, we send you there so often. We've had James Robison in studio and Jay Richards and John Smirik and a variety of individuals. Just an outstanding place to go. She writes not only for The Stream, but for Town Hall and the Christian Post and a number of other organs and outlets. And so, Rachel, welcome to Point of View today.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Let's talk about this for just a minute because you, of course, looked first at the New York Times style manual, now the AP style manual. But wouldn't you agree that the way you define terms in many ways colors the way a reader or a viewer or even a listener, since some of this ends up as copy for radio, actually already begins to perceive the story? Because if I refer to you as anti-something, or if I refer to you as a terrorist versus, say, a lone wolf, they're just different kind of ways in which people react to those labels. True?
Absolutely true. You can put a positive connotation on a topic by using a positive-sounding word. Maybe the word pro, has a positive connotation. You could put a negative spin on a concept by using a word that has negative connotations. This is what the AP has done. Or you can also, one other one I forgot is you can make something sound less nefarious. So instead of saying terrorist, when you use a word like attacker or militant instead, it doesn't sound quite as drastic and quite as evil as terrorist. You also get rid of the connotation to the Islam religion by just, cleaning it up and referring to it as attacker or militant. So, I think this is a very devious thing that the Associated Press and the New York Times and all these other newspapers with their own similar style guides has started doing even more in recent years.
Well, let's talk about the other aspect of it. You talk about things could be less scary, some could be more scary. Instead of saying that he used an AR-15 rifle, semi-automatic rifle, or an AK-47, the style manual seems to indicate that you're supposed to say things like a military-style assault weapon. That sounds a whole lot scarier than an individual that has a deer rifle or has an AR-15.
That's right. And this was a personal pet peeve to me because I was a former gun magazine editor for 2 years, just a few years ago. And so I know that assault weapons, assault rifles, when you put that word assault in there, that is something that has traditionally referred to fully automatic Army, military weapons, for many, many years. So to now change the definition and use this term to describe a mere semi-auto rifle that's just been, modified to add a few parts to make it shoot more accurately, shoot faster, whatever, but still not fully auto, it's being done deliberately to make these average weapons seem much more scary than they really are.
Well, and again, that is part of the problem with the style manual, because you know as well as I do, since you've worked in this field, and I certainly have been following this, most reporters don't know a lot about guns in the first place. So even the words automatic, semi-automatic, those kinds of issues, assault weapons, rifles, this is a little bit strange anyway, because most of them do not own guns. They're not proponents of Second Amendment. Not all, but I mean, most of them are not. This is kind of foreign to them. So they're really going to depend even more on the way in which they're supposed to write it, because they haven't really taken the time or don't have the kind of expertise to make that distinction that would be very important in terms of our gun debate.
Yeah, I mean, the gaffes they make, I mean, I'm sure you see every, couple of weeks there's, some other gaffe made in some mainstream news article about guns. They have no concept, and they refuse to learn. They don't like guns, so they don't want to know about them, and so they just use these same scary-sounded phrases in every article.
Well, let's talk about sex for just a minute, because this is where this has gotten out of hand. Of course, we already mentioned the issue of abortion, but when you get into individuals that are transgender, when you get into individuals that are homosexual, the style manual has really gone out of its way to protect those individuals that would be journalists that actually want to promote the homosexual agenda and actually use some of these terms in a way that would make it difficult for people to really understand the kind of discussion that we need to have about human sexuality.
Yeah, they keep changing the words there as well. You can no longer use words like transvestite. You have to use words like transgender. You're not supposed to use, I can't even keep them all straight, but the latest one, and I think my article at the top updated it, just came out.
I wanted you
my
to get to
earlier
that.
version. Yeah, it's the use of the plural pronoun they to describe to a singular person who does not want to be identified as a male or a female. So you can no longer refer to someone as he or she. You have to use the word they if they want to have the word they.
Or again, the Z or some of these other ones. I have an appeal letter going out right now that talks about this. I can't even keep track of all these pronouns, but we've always sort of understood that when you're talking about a man, then you talk about his, or a woman, her, and now the style manual lets you say they, which is just bad grammar, bad English, but that's what they've had to sort of come up with so that you no longer identify the gender, the sexual background of an individual. And at this point, you start saying, are we starting to lose our minds even in our style manual? You can't say his or her any longer, but that apparently is what's begun to develop in the latest changes in the 2017 AP Style Manual.
And what this does is it normalizes it. If you're allowed to use bad grammar, and that's completely acceptable, and you see it in news articles all the time now used to describe these people, that means what they're doing is probably normal and okay. That's the message they are sending to society. And, that's still a very debatable issue, whether, people can have a third gender or non-gender or whatever it is, but they're arbitrarily making that decision for us.
Let me just, as we're coming to a break, mention that there are some value in the style manual. For example, if you don't believe that the issue of climate change is as big an issue as some people think it would be, even though there are all sorts of editorials and op-ed pieces that will refer to you as a climate change or climate science denier, if I understand the style manual, at least it doesn't allow you to go that far. Or another example, and that is if a child is born out of wedlock, we do not refer to that child as illegitimate. So there are some positive things that come from the style manual, but when we come back, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about a couple of these others. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to join our conversation today, maybe you've seen some evidence of bias in terms of labels that have used, or maybe definitions that are used in such a way to really prejudice the conversation. And if indeed we are expecting the news media to be objective and to present both sides. Well, those days seem to be pretty much gone. So it's more important for us than ever to really exercise a level of biblical discernment. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to post this article by Rachel Alexander, How AP Style Leans Left, and also it's linked to a previous article she's written there as well. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some examples you've seen, 1-800-351-1212. Going to spend a little more time with her and get your opportunity to join the conversation if you'd like to do so. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with Rachel Alexander right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. $3.25 million. That's the price one New Jersey town will pay for its religious discrimination. Not long ago on this program, I told you about the refusal of Bernards Township, New Jersey, to grant a building permit to the Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey. The society fought City Hall for at least 4 years, having their application denied 9 separate times. In November 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the township, alleging a violation of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The Department of Justice won just 2 months later. But by May 2017, the township decided to give up the fight, settle with the government, and allow the Islamic Society to build their mosque. This is good news for religious liberty. Though Bernards Township, in this case, used their zoning laws to prevent the building of a mosque, it could have just as easily been a synagogue, a church, a cathedral, or other house of worship. City governments cannot intentionally throw up permitting obstacles to religious organizations. They must treat a religious organization's application for land use just like it would any other land use application. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Rachel Alexander. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to David in North Carolina, listening on the Good News Network. David, thank you for joining us today. What's your question?
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it, sir. My question is for you, and is if the lady's still on the phone.
Sure is.
Okay, my question is, are the stylistic phrases being used in such a way that the Roman mob used to be used? In other words, you control the mob, you control Rome, since America seems to be that way now. Or is it that it's being used to brainwash our younger generation into saying, yeah, this is all normal. It's been this way since I can remember. It's all normal. Or is it maybe a bit of both?
That's a good point. Rachel, any thoughts? Because certainly there is this idea that maybe intention is to make sure we don't label people in a way that is offensive to them. But, of course, in this world of microaggressions, almost everything is offensive. But
we talked about that yesterday.
Yeah. What you think, Rachel?
I think the caller makes a really good point, and I think, his hunch that it's both of those, control the mob and future generations are just going to always have lived with it, so they just think it's normal. That's absolutely what they're trying to do. It's a brilliant approach to be able to accomplish those two things.
Well, I guess you got your answer. It's probably a both and. So, David, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's, if we can, get into, I mentioned microaggression. It came up yesterday since we were talking about that. At one point, Chelsea Yeoman was saying that she was watching what was happening in California because they've got a case out there with First Liberty, and she was just shocked. I don't know why she was shocked, but this was the first time she'd seen it, that the word alien could not be used. And, of course, you have the style manual here, and they don't want you to even use the word migrant or refugee, much less the word alien. Now, the problem with that is she's sitting there with a legal background saying, do you not know that the Federal Register uses the word alien? I mean, people can say, well, this is a microaggression. But the bottom line is some of these terms have real meaning. They have real definition in the federal regulations, in the state constitutions, and the rest. And when you can't use words like migrant or refugee or alien, and for people coming to Europe right now, there are people struggling to enter Europe. And I'm not making this up, am I? Isn't that what you found in the AP Style Manual?
It's so ridiculous, and you can't even identify exactly what these people are like anymore. Like refugee, we would know that's somebody fleeing a country that persecutes them, probably a Middle Eastern country where they have, a strict Islamic religion. But by just saying people struggling to enter Europe, I mean, you've just washed it of any meaning. And the thing that bothers me, I'm a former recovering attorney myself, is, they're going to have to go in now and change all the federal registers and all the references to, migrants and refugees and aliens, and it's going to cost taxpayers, millions of dollars to make all these changes, and it's all unnecessary. And one more thing I should point out, they've even gotten rid of the term undocumented. Remember when we were supposed to stop using illegal alien and just start using undocumented? Now undocumented isn't even nice enough to refer to these people or sanitized enough. And so in my search of the AP Stylebook, I couldn't even find what you're supposed to use now instead. So for like the illegal Mexican immigrants that come over the border, what do you call them? People struggling to enter the U.S.?
Yes. Well, again, this is another issue. And before taking another phone call, some people might say, okay, smart people, what would you do? And my argument has always been, and I've said this on this program for decades, that my approach has been to use the label that a person chooses for themselves unless the label is just ludicrous. In other words, if they refer to themselves as a freedom fighter, we'll call them a freedom fighter. But, the AP Style Manual said, no, you got to call them Contras or whatever. And if they call themselves pro-life, well, I will call them pro-life. And if they want to call themselves pro-choice, okay, I'll call them pro-choice. And in most cases, that seems to be the best way to go. And, of course, some things change. There was a time in which referring to individuals that were African-American, calling them black was fine. Now they say, well, we should use the word African-American. But even when I write a column or make a commentary, if I'm making a distinction between the white population and the black population, I'll use it there. But I try as much as I can within reason to use the labels that people use about themselves, because I think that's the least offensive. What I've found over the years with the AP Style Manual is they will say, I don't care if you call yourself pro-life, we're not going to allow you to call yourself pro-life. And that, I think, is the big flaw, because you have an elite group of individuals telling all sorts of editors, all sorts of columnists, all sorts of reporters, all sorts of journalists, this is what you must use if you're going to actually adhere to the AP Style Manual. I think that's part of the difficulty.
Yeah, it is. And, what I find ridiculous is my boyfriend is black. He's half black. He's part Indian as well. And, he doesn't want to be called African-American because it doesn't really fit him. But the media would make us refer to him that way. And what I find so ridiculous as a journalist myself is if I turn in an article to a mainstream newspaper and I use the word anti-abortion and I'm, writing about a pro-life issue that I care about, they're going to change all my references of the word pro-life to anti-abortion
Right.
in my article.
And that gets us right to another question I want to take. Let's go to Longview, Texas. In this case, Patricia. I think your question relates very much to the conversation we're having. So what is it?
Yeah, I had just turned the radio on earlier when y'all were on the transgender, all that kind of stuff, and y'all keep saying, they say we can't say this, and they, and like I say, who is they?
Who is they?
And,
That's a good question.
And then,
yeah.
And so my freedom, you know, if they feel like they want to be called this and this and this, I feel myself that I can take an old Webster's and get diction, you know, find out the real meaning of something. And like I say, if you're going on feelings, then you got to let the murderers go that felt like murdering somebody. They've got to quit the ridiculous stuff, whoever they are.
Yeah. And the they, let's talk about that for just a minute, Rachel, before we let you go. Part of it is, in this case, we're talking about the editors that put together the AP Style Manual. But in some respects, the they also goes all the way back to the universities, that major professors in J schools, journalism schools, and others are really kind of establishing the rules. And it's a pretty small, pretty elite group, and a group that in many cases certainly does not accept some of the philosophical, political, and theological issues accepted by a large portion of my audience.
That's right. It's an elite group of journalists, you know, that have put together this AP style book. But it's more than that. You've got complicit people, especially people on the left, who have been doing the same thing. It's being done hand in hand. So even though the AP Journal style book is instructing you to write this way, it's being reinforced and pushed by people like President Obama. You know, we all remember when he quit referring to Islamic terrorists, he wouldn't use the word terrorist anymore.
Yes. Well, again, the article, which I would encourage you to read, and it also has a link to the previous one. This one's on the AP Style Book, and there's an earlier article. There's a link there about biases in the New York Times Style Manual. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this, Rachel, is I wanted our listeners to have a level of discernment. That's one reason why I encourage them to go to our Point of View website. Another reason I encourage them to go to the stream and read your article. So, Rachel, thank you for spending some time today with us here on Point of View.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. God bless.
Looking forward to the next opportunity. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to get into kind of the broad kind of worldview issues. We're going to be talking with Dr. Chris Thurman about this book, The Lies We Believe About God, Knowing God for Who He Really Is. This is going to be important in terms of developing a Christian world and life view. It's also going to be helpful because in some respects, some of the psychological problems people have go all the way back to an improper view of God. So I think you're going to really benefit from this conversation. And if you benefit from the things we talk about every day here on Point of View, hope you visit our website, pointofview.net, click on that donate button, and recognize that we need your financial support. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll spend some time with Dr. Chris Thurman. All that coming up right after this.
When I heard Point of View explain about secular humanism, it drove us to really begin a school.
More than 30 years ago, Rodney Hare heard about a pressing need for the children of his community, and he took action, starting Liberty Christian School, that today provides excellence in academics and spiritual life to nearly 1,300 students and their families. Rodney knows without Point of View, that legacy would not exist.
Without those of us that are able to really help substantially in giving sacrificially, Point of View will never be as strong as it could be. We cannot let anything happen to Point of View Radio.
Giving sacrificially means something different to each of us, but each of us can do something. Discover what you can do at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. Please don't put it off. Take that step now and join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about some of the lies we believe about God, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, if you really want to have a consistent Christian world and life view, it begins with your view about God. And so certainly if we get that wrong at the beginning, it's going to affect all sorts of other aspects of your worldview. But also just from a personal health and mental health perspective, some of us have some very incorrect views about God. We think God wants to shame us, God wants to punish us, that God is not a God of love, or God forgives all of our mistakes and there's no consequence to disobedience. And that is certainly a very important issue as well. So that's why I was thrilled to see this new book by Dr. Chris Thurman. Many of you that have ever listened to the Meyer Clinic certainly have benefited from some of the things he used to share on that program. And of course, he is the author of so many books talking about lies, the lies we believe, the lies couples believe, the lies we tell ourselves. Even a week of radio programs I did years ago on some of the lies about psychology, which was in his book, Self-Help or Self-Destruction. So those are all great resources, but this one in particular I thought would be very helpful to you, and it has just come out. It is published by our friends at David C. Cook. We have information about Dr. Chris Thurman and the book on our website, pointofview.net. He is a psychologist in private practice in Austin, Texas, had his Ph.D. in counseling psychology from the University of Texas, author of many books, which I just mentioned. And Chris Thurman, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me on.
Appreciate the good work that you have done over the years. And would you not agree, as a counselor, that if people have an incorrect view about God, that's going to affect even such issues as their mental health, the way in which they deal with psychological problems and even spiritual problems in their lives?
Yeah, I think so, Kerby. I was struck by a quote from Tozier that said, "The single most important thing about you is your view of God." And I believe that to be true. And when I work with clients throughout the week, what I'm constantly more struck by is how the way they're going through life and the way they cope is foundationally always tied back to their view of God, and that's why I think sometimes people go through life more anxious, more angry, more self-medicative. So to me, your view of God is everything, and it really has all kinds of ripple effect throughout your life, your emotional health, your relationships, and certainly your walk with the Lord.
Well, and again, it's going to affect the way you parent your kids. It's going to be the way you interact with other individuals. And on the other side, sometimes if an individual has had a bad relationship with their earthly father, it affects the way they perceive their heavenly father. So there are certainly a lot of issues associated with this. And I just might mention that in this book, there are 12 chapters, but the 10 that we're going to focus on, of course, are those 10 different lies that we believe about God. And I'm not sure we'll get through all 10, but we'll see how we can do, because I do believe that some of these are so relevant to where people are in terms of their Christian life, and even maybe would be helpful to them if they're struggling with a particular issue in their life, or if they're counseling or interacting with someone else who, because of that improper view of God, sees God as the cosmic killjoy, as a person who is a shamer, or that maybe God has completely lost control of the world, or that God just simply turns a blind eye to our disobedience. These are all issues you talk about in the book. So let's get to the first one, and that is the lie that God's love must be earned. And you refer to that as love of another kind. If you grew up in a household where there were very strict rules and your parents would only give you love and acceptance if you did well in school, if you were not disobedient, you can see how that very quickly translates into the way many people perceive God.
I think so, Kerby. We all grow up in families where our mom and dad are human. And as human beings, we can't help but be a little bit conditional, if you will, in the way we treat our kids. And I'm not trying to psychobabble it here, and I think most parents really do the best job they can to unconditionally love their children. But I do think we grow up in a conditional world. I do think that we then assume that God can't be much different from that. And I know in my own life, I grew up in a military family where there was a lot of emphasis on performance and a lot of attention that would come positively if you did well and negatively if you didn't. And I also grew up in a church background that was rather rules and legalistically oriented. And I think I pretty early on decided that his love for me had to be merited, that I had to morally be semi-perfect for him to love me, and that I could actually raise or lower the love of God. So this opening lie chapter was incredibly important to me personally, and I see a lot of clients and friends and loved ones that I think have this misguided view of God, that he's no different from what we know down here on earth, and that his love does has to be merited.
One of the things you talk about in the book is you are worthy of eternal love. There are questions that I've heard counselors sometimes ask. What do you think God thinks of you right now? And it's amazing how many of them say, well, I think God's really disappointed in me. I'm not worthy of God's love right now. And that illustrates some of the aspect of what you're talking about, doesn't it?
It does. And later on, I'm sure we'll get to the chapter on the wrath of God. But, there's no doubt but what God hates sin. But it's pretty clear to me in Scripture that we are absolutely the apple of his eye, and that he loves us in a way that we can't even begin to grasp, and that while he might be disappointed in our actions, he certainly never ever stops having agape love for us, and is, just wanting us to rest in that, not go out there anxiously trying to earn it, but just know that we are his image bearers and that we are worthy of his love. We're not entitled to it, but we're worthy of it, and that we can calm down and then go out and, as an act of gratitude, be obedient unto Christ rather than do it because we think we're going to gain favor with God.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation today with Dr. Chris Thurman. This is a book published by David C. Cook. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to order it online if you would like to do so. And again, certainly go to your bookstore, because there's a place where you can certainly find it, but if not, there you can get it both in hardcover and in Kindle. And we also have a link to Chris Thurman's website, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. When we come back, we'll talk about not only this issue of love being earned, but what about this? Is God a shamer? In other words, do you have shame in your life and God just wants you to live in that shame? And then what about this idea of whether or not God ever deals with our disobedience? What about the fact that maybe some believe that God has lost control of the universe? We have a lot more to cover. It's all in the book, The Lies We Believe About God, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably heard someone say that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. It is attributed to Joseph Goebbels, but we also have seen it in action. Say something long enough and the people start to believe that it is true. I thought about that when I read the latest issue of Imprimus, which is published by Hillsdale College. It was a summary of a speech by former Sports Illustrated editor Charles Larson about the false stories about Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb holds all sorts of baseball records, including a .366 lifetime batting average and the fact that he stole home 54 times. He was an amazing baseball player, but he also was slandered by a book published after his death. Stories about him beating up black men and sharpening his spikes to injure fielders were all false, but they were repeated so often that most people assumed that they were true. Robert Knight, in a recent column in the Washington Times, uses these lies about Ty Cobb to point to similar examples today. The Black Lives Matter slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot," comes from the false narrative of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The claims that voter ID laws are merely being used to suppress minority vote is another example. Never mind that many of the legislators sponsoring these bills are African American. Consider how the media covers the undercover videos of Planned Parenthood. Usually they ignore them, but when they do talk about the videos, they usually always use the narrative, heavily edited videos. Anyone who looks at the entire unedited videos available online can see that this description is inaccurate and unwarranted. Whether in baseball or politics, we can see the sad reality that repetition can often turn a lie into the truth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Chris Thurman, talking about the lies we believe about God. This is very important in terms of developing your Christian world and life view, but also important in terms of your own psychology, if you will, your own mental health. And so we encourage you to pay attention, get a copy of the book, and you'll find all sorts of links to Dr. Chris Thurman's website as well as to this book. It's published by David C. Cook. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link here on our website as well, pointofview.net. One of the chapters is on whether or not God wants to shame us. You even have a quote from Kurt Thompson. He's been on the program with us a couple of times, and we talked about the spiritual mind and even his book, The Soul of Shame. But there is this kind of this idea that really God wants us to feel our shame, that we are just, it's kind of worm theology, that really the only way we can be a good Christian is to be completely humbled in shame before the Lord. We are to be humble before the Lord, but that shame part of that equation sometimes slips in, and it's not an accurate view of God, is it?
I don't think so, Kerby. I think that the enemy is the one who wants us to be coated in shame. I think we tend to assume that God is wanting to rub our nose in our mistakes, to shame us for the sinful things that we do. I think that ever since the fall, when they went from naked and unashamed to naked and ashamed, that's been a battle for 99.9% of all human beings. It's this feeling of toxic shame, whether it's I'm a horrible no-goodnik, to I'm not worthy of love, to whenever there's a break in a relationship, it's always got to be my fault because I'm just an awful human being. So I do think this is a big ticket item for a lot of us. I know in my own life, I've, had this real internal battle with feeling a lot of shame and had to really, renew my mind about who God is and that he's not into shaming, but he is into bringing me into conviction, and that there's a big difference between shame and conviction over your sins and having godly sorrow that leads to repentance. So it's an important chapter of the book to really have a higher view of God than that he would be a shamer and condemner, and instead see that he made us in his image, that he's rebirthed us, that he has put us in his family, that he's made us part of his plan to redeem the world, and that we don't need to walk around with our heads down as if we are worthless no-goodniks.
A related chapter, I'll jump ahead, is this one that God is mean and vindictive, and you call that chapter Goodwill Hunting. Walt Whitman, the quote you have there is, God is a mean-spirited, pugnacious bully bent on revenge against his children for failing to live up to his impossible standards. If you quote from some of the so-called new atheist, Richard Dawkins has again this image of God as this horrible, mean-spirited, biased, bigoted individual. And even though most of the Christians listening might not buy into that, this is sort of a help in terms of evangelism, because what I find is oftentimes when you talk to someone who says, well, I don't believe in God, I oftentimes ask, well, what God do you believe in? What do you think God is? And when I hear that description, and when we've talked about this on the air, when others have asked that question of non-believers, the response from us is always, well, I don't believe in that God either. And so there is this kind of unbiblical view about God as mean and vindictive. And even though I think most Christians would say, no, I believe in the goodness of God, when you get down to where they begin to react to some of the things that happen in their life, you realize that those ideas that are being promulgated right now by the so-called new atheists have kind of even crept into the minds of many Christians, hasn't it?
I think so. I think a lot of us have allowed that view of God to become part of how we think about him, and that we buy into a little bit, at least, that God's mean, that he's vindictive, that he's chronically standing there with a stick in his hand, wanting to whack us. And so in that chapter, I talk a lot about what does the goodness of God mean. Can we get back to realizing in a deeper way that it's one of his core attributes, that the goodness of God is one of his core ways of being? And I go into the story of the pastor who started Goodwill, and I tried to make the point that if a human being can have this kind of goodwill to where this very powerful, kind of organization got started, then why would we think God's anything less and not 1,000 times more? So I'm trying to switch my own view to God is a God of goodness, and he's out to do us good, and he is out to help us, not to harm us, and his goodness is extravagant. It goes beyond what even we could have hoped for or imagined, and that we've got to see him as goodwill on the hunt. He's on the prowl to do goodwill to us or express it, whereas the enemy is on the prowl to devour us.
Yes. So again, we've looked at some of the issues that people might have. Well, God is certainly mean or vindictive, or God wants to shame us, or God wants to withhold his love until we show our performance. But there's another kind of situation that people opt out for. That's in chapter 4, and that is that God has kind of lost control of everything. Now, again, we would recognize that's not accurate theologically, but that is certainly one of the ways in which some people that aren't Orthodox have really begun to deal with that, because if indeed they start with the idea that God, if he was all-powerful, could destroy evil, And if God was all loving, he would want to destroy evil. And if he's all knowing, he would see that evil would come into the world. And since evil exists, either God does not exist, so we reject that because that's the atheistic view. So it must mean that God's maybe not all powerful, or God, because he allows human freedom, allows a lot more evil and a lot more pain and shame and suffering to take place. So how do we think about this? Because that really gets us back to our view of the sovereignty of God.
Well, I think, Kerby, that back to your original starting point on this, I think that because the world is so chaotic and there is so much evil taking place, that we can unfortunately go from what our eyes see to concluding that God just doesn't have control anymore, that somehow all of what we see down here is evidence that he has lost control over his creation. So I try to take us back to his omni qualities, meaning God is all-knowing, okay? And that's what you'd have to be. You'd have to know everything that can be known in order to be in control, and he does. Secondly, he's all-powerful, and that's what you would have to be in control, is that nothing happens outside of your power, and that you have the power to do anything you want to do whenever you want to do it. And thirdly, that God is everywhere at once, that he's omnipresent. So I'm trying to drive home there. Let's give God the credit that he certainly warrants. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and everywhere at once. He has not lost control, but he does allow for free will. And he does permit people to do things that even break his heart. But for some reason, he's not going to shut all that down or control everybody to where they can't do wrong things.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues. Does God ignore our disobedience? That gets into the wrath of God. And does God give us everything we want in life? That's kind of the prosperity gospel. And is it possible that God sometimes sugarcoats the painful things he wants us to face about ourselves? And what about the kind of change that can take place? And is it possible that God can be defeated? There's still a lot of other issues we'll talk about today with Dr. Chris Thurman. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, feel free to sit back and listen to the program. And if you want to find out a little bit more, first of all, we have a link to the book, and we also have a link to Dr. Chris Thurman's website. It is drchristhurman.com. You don't even have to write it all out. We have a link there so that you can find out more about him, about his seminars, his books, and other resources. So let me encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. As you do so, don't forget that your support helps us to bring these kinds of programs to you. And today, really important for you to think a little bit more biblically about who God is so that you don't accept the lies that we believe about God. That's the book we're talking about. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Chris Thurman right after these important messages.
There are those who listen to Point of View while they're driving, and some can listen at home or at work. But here's the question: where do you go where you cannot listen to Point of View? Well, if you have the app, the free Point of View radio app, the answer is just about nowhere. This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Click the Take Action link. Learn about important issues and make a difference in this world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, easily contact us with your comments or questions. Don't leave home or the office or anywhere else without Point of View. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the free Point of View radio app. Oh, and one more thing, if you like it, click that little button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app, with you on the go.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Chris Thurman as we talk about this book, The Lies We Believe About God, Knowing God is Who He Really Is. And it is published by David C. Cook. Look for it in your local bookstore. But we also have information about Chris Thurman, as well as about the book on our website, pointofview.net. Chris, let's, if we can, focus on the other aspect. Up until now, we've been talking about God as our enemy, or God as a person that wants to be mean, vindictive, bring shame. There's the other extreme, and that is God's not our enemy, but God's our buddy. He's like the easy to convince parent, or the substitute teacher who just turns a blind eye to our disobedience. And in one of the chapters, you really bring us back to another important biblical truth that seems to have been lost a lot in this 21st century culture, and that is the idea of the wrath of God. How do we think about God in that particular context?
Well, I don't think we hear very often anymore about the wrath of God. I don't know if I've heard a sermon on it in forever. And yet I think it's a real rich area for misunderstanding about God, because, again, when most people think about the wrath of God, they think about more of a mean, hateful anger from God. And so here the focus is on, there is no doubt but what God absolutely detests sin. He is holy, he is pure, and nothing in him tolerates or is okay with sin. And therefore, we have to quit thinking of him as somebody who is going to ignore when we mess up, that somehow he's going to be this indulgent parent who turns a blind eye to our disobedience, and really shift it so much that we see that it's because he loves us that he disciplines us. But he loves us too much to ignore our disobedience. And no parent in their right mind would raise a kid to where you ignore when they're acting out, because they become this really, semi-horrible acting human being that nobody's going to want to hire, nobody's going to want to marry. So the wrath of God is a pretty important concept to get back to, but to see it more accurately for what it really is.
And you've got a whole section on that, and I would encourage people to read that and maybe even use that in a sermon topic, or even in a small group study or Bible fellowship. But a related one is this idea that God gives us everything we want in life. Mm-hmm. That's the other aspect of this idea of God as an indulgent parent. The first one is, well, God just sort of turns a blind eye to our disobedience. This one is God's kind of like a slot machine, like an ATM machine. He's like an indulgent parent. He's like a easy pushover uncle or something of that nature. And that one also is one that we need to pay attention to if we're going to have a proper understanding of who God is.
I think that's right, Kerby. I entitled that chapter, Santa Claus Isn't Coming to Town.
Yes.
And so I try to drive home the idea that far too many of us think of God as a cosmological Santa Claus, and that if we behave right, we even fall into thinking that obligates him to give us whatever we want. And so here I'm trying to, again, refine our view of God, and I'm trying to go back to the idea that he is a gift giver. It's not that he isn't a gift giver, but he only gives us what is, it says every true and perfect gift is from above. So he gives us gifts that are truly in our best interest, that help us to grow, that help meet a need that's valid. He's not an overindulgent grandfather who just spoils you with everything you ask for. and that we've got to move away from thinking of God as a Santa Claus who we give him our wish list and then we get mad and bitter if he doesn't give us everything we ask for in life.
Well, again, just some very important principles in this book, the lies we believe about God. And another kind of third aspect is not only is kind of God turning a blind eye to our disobedience, and God is giving us everything we want in life, but you have another chapter on God sugarcoats the painful things he wants us to face about ourselves. And a lot of this has to do with, for example, the woman at the well, of course, the disciples, and importantly, even the hypocritical religious leaders, that when we have Jesus Christ on this earth, the Son of God, he really is very critical of those who live hypocritical lives. He spends more time criticizing the religious leaders than he does some of the non-religious individuals. So again, this idea that God turns a blind eye to our disobedience, or he sugarcoats some of the painful aspects, the hypocrisy in our lives, is again an unbiblical and unfortunate view of who God is, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's also very important for us to rethink. I find it, I've been in the counseling field for 40 years, and yes, I have found it harder over time to shoot straight with people. I used to be able to have a lot more freedom to speak the truth in love to people 40 years ago than I feel I can today.
Interesting.
And so people are just not all that open to a rebuke anymore. And, you know, a lot of times they will get insulted if you dare to speak straightforwardly to what they're doing and call it wrong if it's wrong. In that chapter, I go into the movie Mary Poppins, where they have that song, "A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down." Mm-hmm. And in this day and age, you know, it's like people really want a spoonful, if not a whole cup full of sugar with everything you tell them. And so, not that Christ was ever abusive in his words, but he certainly did not pull his punches. And it was very interesting when he would, you know, speak very directly to people about their situation. Yes, you are not married. You have been married 5 times. You know, it's you are a generation of vipers and whitewashed tombs, you Pharisees. And so there at times was the velvet touch from Christ where it was kind and genteel, but that was usually with a person who had ears to hear. The folks that have clogged ears and that are kind of arrogant enough to be resistant to the truth being spoken to them, you know, there was a real directness and a clarity and a firmness. And I think that's something that we just have to learn how to handle, is the truth. Yeah. We've got to be willing to humble ourselves and hear people speak truth to us. And that's especially true in our political world, where people need to speak truth to power, right?
Yes. Well, again, this whole idea, you can't handle the truth, but the other aspect of that is, I had people sometimes say, well, you seem awfully judgmental. And my response is, well, if you think I'm judgmental, wait till you meet Jesus. Because, we have sort of this Jesus of our own creation, that he's just pale, he's accepting, he's mild-mannered. And there are places where Jesus is talking about, obviously, the lilies of the field, and where he's reaching people, neither do I condemn you. But most of the time, Jesus is confronting people in ways that I think we've forgotten about in this sort of non-judgmental culture of the 21st century. So that is a very helpful chapter as well. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will get into the last 2. And we actually have done, I think, a pretty good job of covering these 10 different lies about God. And if you've just joined us, I would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You could listen to the entire interview or download the podcast, send it to some others, or go to the YouTube channel when it's up there. But also, let me encourage you to go a couple of other places. The first is that if you would like to know a little bit more about the work that Dr. Chris Thurman does, you can simply go to his website, It is drchristhurman.com. You don't have to write all of that out, but we certainly have a link. There's a place where you can learn a little bit more about him. You can learn about some of his seminars and presentations, his books, and if you'd like to even know more about counseling, that's all available on the website. If you click on the picture of the book, we have a link so that you could order it if you can't find it in your local bookstore, although I suspect it will be very easy to find, and it's available both in hardcover and as a Kindle ebook. So there are all sorts of resources that we always make available at our website, pointofview.net. And so as you go there, take the time to click on some of those links. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Chris Thurman or like to follow him and various things he writes, we made that very easy for you to do. And as we've always mentioned, since we are a listener-supported program, if you can also click on that button that says donate and help us out, this is how you can help us continue to bring these kinds of programs to you as well, because I think it is absolutely key that we have the proper view of God that will affect not only our Christian worldview, but it will affect our lives and the way in which we deal with challenges in our life. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Chris Thurman right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. $3.25 million. That's the price one New Jersey town will pay for its religious discrimination. Not long ago on this program, I told you about the refusal of Bernards Township, New Jersey, to grant a building permit to the Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey. The society fought City Hall for at least 4 years, having their application denied 9 separate times. In November 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the township, alleging a violation of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The Department of Justice won just 2 months later. But by May 2017, the township decided to give up the fight, settle with the government, and allow the Islamic Society to build their mosque. This is good news for religious liberty. Though Bernards Township, in this case, used their zoning laws to prevent the building of a mosque, it could have just as easily been a synagogue, a church, a cathedral, or other house of worship. City governments cannot intentionally throw up permitting obstacles to religious organizations. They must treat a religious organization's application for land use just like it would any other land use application. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A few more minutes spending our time today with Dr. Chris Thurman as we talk about his book, The Lies We Believe About God. A couple more we'd like to cover real quickly. And first of all, that God changes us. Talk about that idea, because that's also one of those very important principles, and that we really don't have to be stuck in where we are, but we can actually see that God can bring about significant change in our life.
I think, Kerby, the enemy is always in the extremes. So on this one, I think he would like for us to go one of two routes, kind of a let go and let God, and he's going to change me, and I don't have to roll up my sleeves and do any hard work. And the other would be that I can just do all the hard work on my end, and I don't involve God at all.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going after the idea that if we are going to grow in Christ, if we are going to mature, if we are going to go from when I was a child, I thought and I reasoned like one, to an adult who thinks and reasons like an adult and lives like an adult, we have to dance with God metaphorically. We have to do our part because he won't do that, and we can't do his part, which is to empower it, to give us the Holy Spirit, to guide us, to direct us, to equip us with spiritual gifts. So it's just basically trying to say there is a important collaborative effort that has to go on between us and God for personal transformation and change to take place.
Well, again, one of the things that you mentioned here is this little, if you will, kind of equation by Max Anders. And I would encourage people to get a copy of the book because it's WKG plus WDG plus PC plus OB plus TNT. Well, what it is the work of God plus the Word of God plus personal commitment plus other believers plus time and trials gives you spiritual maturity. So it's just a wise understanding that there are a number of elements that come together for the change necessary for people to make. But just before we run out of time, let's take the 10th one. I think we did pretty well at going through all 10. And this particular lie is God doesn't know us very well. Again, you would think that most people theologically would say that, not say that because they, remember Jesus saying that God knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows who you are. Things are not done in secret. But nevertheless, sometimes, even though maybe theologically we don't believe that, experientially, sometimes we do believe that. Or we believe that, well, if God only knew the kind of pressures or temptations I was under, he would cut me some slack. And this is where I think the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus faced all the kinds of temptations and possible trials that we would face. And we have a great high priest who is not unfamiliar with what we have to deal with as human beings.
Yeah, that's great, Kerby. I don't mean to psychobabble anything during our time together, but I do think a lot of us grow up feeling like nobody or very few people took the time to really get to know us well, to know us for who we really are. And again, if we're not careful, we can think that God is just so busy running the universe that we're kind of not really all that important to him, or that he doesn't know us. So here I'm trying to just, I use the story of Job to try to drive home that God knew Job so intimately, as he does all of us, that he knew Job was the one to bring up to the enemy for, if you want to try to sift somebody, have you considered my servant Job? And he knew him well enough to know that Job would be up to the task. So here I'm just trying to say, there's an intimacy with which God knows each and every one of his image bearers that would just fry our circuits if we could ever grasp it. And we sure don't need to think about him as if he's indifferent or doesn't know when we wake and when we fall asleep and how many hairs are on our head and what our personality makeup is like and what we're passionate about, and just everything that anyone could know about us. God knows it all.
Just before we run out of time, let's talk about how people could use this book. For example, how could people benefit from this? Is this something that could maybe be taught in a small group or a Bible fellowship? What did you intend with this book, The Lies We Believe About God?
Yeah, I wrote it, for, if there is such a thing, the average person who's really wanting to grow in Christ and in their relationship with God. And I wrote it with an eye toward, my hope was, I sure hope churches will latch onto this book and get it down to the Sunday school class level, the small group level, and encourage their community groups to go through it. So we wrote it with that kind of bent, We wrote it with discussion questions. I would even love to see it used in youth programs, jail ministries, MOPS programs. To me, all of us, our view of God is a huge issue, and I just wanted it to be out there for the glory of God so that our view of him would be raised higher and be loftier. But yes, I did want it to be in as many group settings as possible. I even have a secret hope that a few pastors around the country might actually teach from it, in a sermon series.
Well, that's what I was thinking as well. As people go to your website, drchristhurman.com, I've mentioned it a few times there, but people can find out more about your seminars, presentations, if they were even looking for counseling or other books. That's all available at your website, isn't it?
It is. The website is there for that purpose, is just to let people know about what I'm up to, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
So again, just some great resources available. And again, Dr. Chris Thurman has been with us today. So Chris, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Again, the book is entitled The Lies We Believe About God. And of course, you might be familiar with some of the other books that he has written. Probably the best known, The Lies We Believe, which in some respects looks at a broader issue, but this one looks at the issue of God. And so if you find yourself maybe not necessarily having biblical thinking, or you would like to maybe have a ministry with people that aren't thinking biblically, these are some other resources I certainly wanted to put in your hands, because I think it would be very helpful for you to have these books, to have some of these resources, to teach those from the pulpit, to teach them in a Sunday school class, to teach them in a small group. And so, again, I just wanted you to know about this. And most importantly, we really want you to develop a Christian world and life view and apply it to all areas of life. So, again, The Lies We Believe About God, it is published by David C. Cook. And 10 different lies. We've covered every one of those, although, of course, there's 12 chapters, so there's some other material that we didn't cover. But I think we did a pretty good job in 1 hour of giving you an overview of some of these that perhaps relate to your life. And if at the end you said, oh, you're talking about me, I would hope that you take the time to get a copy of the book. You can either get it in hardback or in Kindle, and you can benefit from that as well. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have our Friday weekend edition. Penna Dexter will be with us, as well as Jeremy Dice. We're going to be looking at a couple of the issues. We'll get back into the news cycle. We have a new health care plan being proposed in the United States Senate. What would that mean to you and your family? Maybe get an update on a couple of religious liberty issues, an update on the ongoing controversy surrounding Donald Trump Jr., and of course we'll get into a few other topics that certainly are relevant. So I hope that you'll join us on that Friday weekend edition and take the time to not only listen but maybe benefit from some of the articles that we post those on your Facebook page or your blog. Use that to start a conversation on many of those issues and have an influence in the lives of others. As one of our callers suggested yesterday, why not use social media? Make a difference. We hope that you will take the material we make available to you and you will multiply that in your own sphere of influence. So again, all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll click on the button there that says donate and help us out as well. I want to thank Andrew and Alyssa for their help behind the scenes. We'll say goodbye for today. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dies of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dies became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. or 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.